Existence University is committed to free minds and to the highest quality of content, and as such, we will never take government or corporate financial support. The following is brought to you by Existence University merchandise, available at the Patreon page You Exist, and also by donations through PayPal or Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you.
The key to the next revolution in physics has been hiding in plain sight for over a century. Let's find out what that key is here on Inductica.
We've been living in sin so long, all the fields are gone. Fella stopped me on the street last night, said everything's
So what is the value of keeping your mind connected to the fact, knowing what's actually the case,
It seems your meal ticket is
knowing
gone,
what's true in
and
reality?
life goes on. I could never imagine something better. Yeah, right. Now you're cooking on high heat in the middle of the street. Roller coaster, take me to a better time. Let's go. All sing your high line with the roller coaster of life. It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life. You seem to easily forget how to place your bet. When everyday life gets you down, you gotta steal the crown. Got to own it. Don't bitch and moan about it, please. God forbid you scrape your knees, and it's nothing to sneeze at. Oh, I've told you over and over again. You gotta get both hands around it and make your own plans. Roller coaster, it's taking over, it's about time. Oh, sing your high line on the roller coaster of life. You've got to all choose your timeline with the roller coaster of life. Roller coaster. I want to go down the rabbit hole, down the rabbit hole of life. And now it's about to leave. Oh, roller coaster.
The existence of fields requires a medium.
This is like saying the existence of cheese requires the existence of fromage. They're just different words in different languages.
Just as sound is a changing property of air, the pressure, these different fields are changing properties of the ether.
And this is like saying the existence of cheese requires the existence of mozzarella. The luminiferous ether was a type of field, or all of these ethers, in a sense, are a type of field. The larger category would be field. Ether would be one type, just like mozzarella would be one type of cheese.
Maybe the real path towards a grand unifying theory is to understand the nature of the ether and how it gives rise to these different fields.
This is very cult-like thinking. This is cult-exalted status of the new scientists of a modern future age. This is us versus them thinking. This is suggesting that what we're doing is not useful, and somehow what he's doing will be useful.
Now, many of you are probably saying, hold up, James. Before you get carried away, Didn't the Michelson-Morley experiment disprove the ether? No. Let me show you.
This rejection of critical analysis and rational thought is quite deceptive, and, again, is the labeling of others being not useful, whereas he's going to save the world. The Michelson-Morley experiment did in fact put an end to the luminiferous ether once and for all.
For those of you unfamiliar, the Michelson-Morley experiment was an ingenious experiment conducted in 1887 to measure the speed the Earth traveled through the ether.
As per usual, this is deceptively oversimplified. Allow me to teach you. From Ole Romer's work, we know that it takes about 8 minutes for the light of the sun to reach Earth in a straight line. So if the sun were to magically vanish, it would take us 8 minutes to notice. The research of this ether that light was traveling through to get from the sun to us led to the scientist James Bradley discovering that light always travels in that ether at the same speed. Further research was then conducted to check whether the Earth's motion, or something about the Earth, was causing it to only appear as if it were traveling at the same speed, through a process they called ether drag. This led to the scientists Michelson and Morley to conclude, through not finding any drag effect, that the ether drag hypothesis, also known as the luminiferous ether theory, was to be rejected. If the effects of the speed of light in vacuum is an illusion, it is not one caused by ether drag. The speed of light as a constant was proven by James Clerk Maxwell by showing that the speed is the speed at which the fields of electricity and magnetism interact. And therefore, nothing can be faster than the causal connections which allow for the existence of all observers. Einstein takes only 2 facts of reality to set up special relativity. 1. The speed of light is the speed of causality. 2. Physics works everywhere, whether you think you are moving or not. These 2 facts, and our fact about the sun's light distance from Earth, helps us set up a great visual of what must be true. The sun is 8 light minutes away from Earth, meaning it takes 8 minutes for light to travel from the sun to Earth. Now imagine a situation where Earth has 2 suns, and it is set perfectly between the 2 suns. We know it is perfectly in between because it takes 8 minutes for light to reach the Earth from both suns. Now imagine that we send 2 rockets off of the planet, one on either side of the planet, complete opposite, aiming towards the 2 suns. Finally imagine that at some small time t, briefly after the rockets launch off, both suns vanish, or explode, or dim, or brighten, or the color changes, whatever, so long as it is a light effect which takes the Earth 8 minutes to notice. Are the events simultaneous to the rockets, like they are for the Earth? Very apparently, they cannot be. For the rocket on the left side is closest to the left sun, and sees that sun's change in less than 8 minutes, and sees the change in the far sun in more than 8 minutes, and vice versa for the rocket on the right. Therefore, what is simultaneous for the Earth was not simultaneous for the rockets, and therefore, if one's understanding of time is based on simultaneous events occurring with the hands of your clock, then time cannot be universal like Newton held. For time to be universal would require that all 3 observers, everyone on the 2 ships and everyone on Earth, sees both suns vanish, or whatever, at the same time, which would mean that light would have to reach the rockets, which are not in the center, at the same time, and at the same time that the Earth receives both simultaneously. This would mean that light would have to travel very fast for the far rocket, normal speeds for the Earth, and slower for the close rocket. This was the presumed position, which is ether drag, as the scientists thought it had to be the case that all 3 were experiencing universal time, and so the ether dragging effects of the rockets and the Earth must be speeding and slowing the light to make it appear as if universal time did not exist. After Michelson and Morley smashed the ether drag, the only conclusion left to draw was that what counts as simultaneous events to one person doesn't mean it's simultaneous for others.
In this experiment, light was shot out of this emitter and passed through a beam splitter. A beam splitter is an optical device which allows half of the light to pass through it, while the other half is reflected.
If light were a particle, would this mean that it would have to be half of an entity? Does this not prove in one sense absolutely that light itself is the entity that is waving? This oversimplification of the discussion has left us without any understanding of what we are even doing. The experiment in real life makes sense given the context of knowledge, but James has formed a superposition of conceptualizations from different millennia into one mixed bag. So we have no means to understand what he means by anything when he says this.
This will create two separate beams. Each of these two beams is reflected off of a mirror so that it's then brought back to the beam splitter. Now, once this happens, part of beam B is reflected off the beam splitter, while part of beam A is transmitted through it, which brings A and B together at the detector at the bottom of the diagram.
Again, this only works because light is a photon, a particle of sorts, and a wave of sorts. These facts are facts because of what the photon is. James ultimately comes to reject the existence of photons, but he is using deception here to make you accept some parts of mainstream science so he can sound like he's on your team. However, he then cuts the tree of knowledge that he is building from at the base of the trunk. So how could he ever disprove photons using photons?
Now, because these beams are waves, they will cancel and strengthen one another in a pattern which looks like this when they overlap at the detector.
Again, this only works because light is a photon, a particle, and a wave. This is called a superposition of the waves, or you could also call it an interference pattern of the waves, both of which require the quantum mechanics that James denies.
Now, the Earth moves really fast around the sun. So the Earth should be moving through the ether, which would cause an ether wind to blow through this setup.
Another oversimplification which ignores the circular motion of the Earth's rotation and revolution. And he ignores the amount of trials and the amount of years and locations around the sun that were being tested, the different angles that the experiment was conducted through, and so much more. He assumes that the Earth seemingly is stationary and is not rotating, turning, and that the ether wind only ever comes in one direction, and that they only rotated the table 90 degrees. None of this is true. We went through the entire Earth cycle. We went through all the days, we went through the whole year, and we turned the table all the way around in every orientation. This oversimplification is just a deception to make you follow his line of thinking, which is entirely off the rails at this point.
Now, to keep things simple, let's say that the ether wind is blowing along the direction of beam B. If this were the case, then beam B would be traveling upwind at first, then downwind after it reflects off that mirror on the right.
If we allow his demonstration to be the actual operation that we follow, this would give us a different pattern than when both of the light waves are not experiencing an ether wave. So we should be able to turn the table about 45 degrees, in which case both will be equally affected or unaffected, and they should give us one sort of interference pattern. Turn the table such that James has it, and there will be a different pattern. So as we keep rotating the table, a different interference pattern should occur. If James turns the table and sees the exact same interference pattern, that doesn't tell him anything, because that could be the exact result of no ether. Nothing he has done in this oversimplification would help him discover anything.
Since light is a wave of the ether, beam B would be slowed down as it moves upwind and sped up as it moves downwind. Now, doing the math, this all has the overall effect of slowing down beam B.
He has now jumped to just forcing light to be ether-related without having actually shown that. But if you actually stop to think about it, if the ether is the light, and the ether is going in this one direction, how does it ever turn around? Or alternatively, is it not the case that the whole situation should be shrunken? What he's presenting physically actually doesn't make sense to what he's saying. He hasn't actually done the math.
So overall, going back and forth, it takes longer as a result of this wind. Now, after recording the pattern in the detector, Michelson and Morley then rotated the table that the experiment was mounted on. This would cause a change in the speed of both A and B.
He has not provided his audience the proper understanding of interference patterns, and therefore, you are left not knowing the extent of these differences, and if anything he's saying is actually true or not. The Michelson-Morley experiment is merely the most famous, but for 50 years there were other interferometer tests, all of which failed to find any ether or ether drag. So, to oversimplify one experiment, as to get the emotional response he wants from his audience, he has to ignore 50 years of failures. One fundamental issue that James does not seem to be aware of is that the ether drag was for corpuscular or particle light. It was in order to push something that was real. If you convert the ether such that it is the thing that's waving, then you actually have no pushing effect. And therefore, the entire point of the ether drag, which was to explain one phenomenon while not being able to explain 99% of the others, that ether drag was only invented to push material particle bodies. If you make it a wave, it no longer makes any sense to even need such a thing as an ether wind. The ether wind would be the light, right? Scientists like Augustin Jean Fresnel and George Stokes proposed alternative solutions to the reason why the speed of light did not seem to be affected by the ether. They assumed that there existed some form of ether drag, where the ether is dragged by the friction of the Earth when it is near the Earth, and has less or no drag in deep space. To understand this, let us return to the umbrella analogy. If the rain is falling straight down, and you were walking perpendicular to the falling rain, the rain would appear to be falling towards you at an angle. The ether dragging hypothesis would be analogous to the idea that as you walk, the air around you is dragged around you, such that when the rain gets close to you, it gets trapped in your local ether and is pushed by your ether wind. This explanation covers why Bradley may have had to tilt his telescope. If the ether is stationary and doesn't ever move, then the motion of the Earth should cause relativity effects, making the light appear to move at an angle as you move perpendicular to it, and straight down as you move parallel to it. However, this at all does not explain how the speed of light appeared to be constant. Thomas Young, in 1804, was one of the scientists that reasoned that light was a wave, and not a corpuscular as Bradley believed, and that the ether was immobile in the frame of reference of the sun, and that the Earth had no effect on the ether. But he could not explain the aberration effect. However, Young was able to show that light is a wave in other experiments. His most famous experiment was the double-slit experiment. If light was a wave like sound or water as they expected, then there ought to be an interference pattern when light moves past and through an object in its path. In the same way that a water wavefront hitting a double slit will cause there to be two circular wavefronts, so should light if it is a wave. Young demonstrated in 1803 that by shining a light through the double slit, there was in fact an interference pattern at the screen. Young also knew that light had to be a wave in order to explain why light reflects and refracts at the same time. If light was a single ball, then it could not do both at once. However, Newton had already demonstrated that the ether, which is what would be waving, cannot be doing so longitudinally. as this would cause the disturbance of the motions of the planets and would cause lighting effects that we do not observe. So it was, at the turn of the 19th century, that light had to be a wave. That wave had to be a wave in something, and that something cannot be a wave like sound. Also, light would have to behave like a particle sometimes. The ether would have to have been densely packed, but rare, transparent, fluid, but sometimes solid, frictionless, and also maybe having ether friction drag. The particle theorists at this time attacked Young in his inability to mathematically describe the interference pattern of the waves of light. They thought that they could explain diffraction with the idea that beads of light bounce off of each other and cancel. The particle theorists thought that they could finally kill the wave theory of light by holding a science contest on diffraction in 1818 at the Academy of Science. The winner of this contest would thus put an end to one of the two theories. Either the particle theory or the wave theory was going to emerge the sole victor. The winner of this contest was Augustin Jean Fresnel, whose paper supported the wave theory of light. Fresnel, without knowing much or anything at all about Huygens and Young, had already integrated their two theories into his own original work. Young, discovering Fresnel, suggested that Fresnel submit his paper to the Academy. Fresnel's idea could explain reflection, refraction, diffraction, and polarization, covering all of the topics that had been fought over for the last 200 years or more. One of the judges of the contest, Simon Denis Poisson, who was a particle theorist, thought that Fresnel's paper had a big issue. That being that the center of a circular shadow would have to have a constructive interference pattern, thus having a bright light spot in the center of a shadow, which he thought was ridiculous. One of the other judges and the head of the committee, Dominique Francois Jean Argot, took up the challenge on behalf of Fresnel and proved that the bright light spot does in fact exist as Poisson predicted. This was the end of the particle theory of light. The only thing that was an issue for the wave theory in the past was the longitudinal nature of the waves, but Fresnel ended that issue by proving that light is a transverse wave, not a longitudinal wave. This had a whole new effect on the theory of ether, as transverse waves cannot travel in fluids, but only in solids. It seems then at odds that the ether had to be a solid to allow light to travel, and yet it had to be a solid that doesn't affect the motions of planetary bodies, therefore returning us back to the issue of ether drag. Fresnel in 1830 came up with the math that would be used for predicting and measuring the ether drag by massive objects. For the next 50 years, the scientists battled it out over whether ether drag was occurring or not. In 1851, Armand Fizeau conducted an experiment with the first interferometer. He believed that the light will be dragged around by a medium, and so he uses columns of water flowing in different directions. Fizeau believed that his experiment demonstrated a partial ether drag, but his results were a lot lower than he had expected. A follow-up experiment by Hoek demonstrated that there was no dragging effect, and Hoek could not figure out why his version of Fizeau's experiment failed. In 1871, George Airy conducts an experiment as laid out by Young in 1804, using stellar aberration and a water-filled telescope. Airy concludes that the stellar aberration remains, and the ether drag could not be measured. In 1881 and 1887, Michelson, and later Michelson and his partner Morley, conduct the most famous ether dragging experiment, the Michelson-Morley interferometer experiment. The Michelson-Morley interferometer experiment found that light appears to move through the ether at the same velocity in every direction, no matter where the Earth is in its orbit, and no matter which way they rotated the experimental apparatus. This is where the conclusion that the ether doesn't exist comes from. But this experiment cannot disprove an ether, something that has to occupy space. This experiment merely showed that the ether was not being dragged. It proves that the luminiferous ether doesn't exist. That light doesn't need a material substance called a medium, like air, water, or glass, in order to travel. It proves that the little stuff which exists where nothing isn't is not a particulate matter. From this experiment, alongside Bradley's and Airy's experiments, we can add to our list of premises which cannot be contradicted. The ether is not a particulate matter. Light traveling through this non-particulate ether retains a constant velocity in all directions to all observers. Part 4. The ether is dead. Long live the ether.
Since each would now be going in a different direction with respect to the ether wind. This will make A and B each be in a different part of their wave cycle by the time they reach the detector, which will cause a measurable difference in the pattern they make when they combine at that detector.
Here is a question that strikes at the heart of the purpose of science. How measurable? Can we see an example, please? Also, this setup is already flawed, as it has set the null hypothesis as ether existing, as opposed to the proper null hypothesis that it does not exist. So fundamentally, it seems that James does not understand the purpose of science.
In this way, Michelson-Morley planned on measuring the speed of the ether wind.
This is fundamentally way too oversimplified, the point of which is so that he can hide information from you, so that he can push through his map of reality.
This experiment required painstaking precision. Michelson actually suffered a nervous breakdown while trying to conduct the experiment.
And this is why I had stated that he oversimplified it for the purpose of an emotional response. Laughing at a man for trying to prove that in fact which James wants to prove himself. Why is that funny? This feels very much like a cult promotion of listen to me or you will lose your mind.
And after all of this effort, they detected nothing.
Detecting nothing is not a bad thing. It is proof that that which they were looking for did not exist in the form that they thought it did.
Michelson and Morley tried a number of tricks, but they couldn't get this apparatus to detect motion through the ether. Modern physicists have taken this as proof that there is no ether.
Another deceptive super oversimplification. 1. 50 years of experimental testing led to that conclusion, not simply Michelson and Morley and their tricks. 2. That conclusion is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt today. It is no longer 1886. 3. Physics today studies the ether on a daily basis. They just don't happen to call it the ether, because the ether is a false concept. That which is a very bad version of what a field is. Example in a different field. Germ theory explains miasma. Miasma is the old theory that disease was caused by bad air. Miasma and the ether are the same kind of true. The kind that are easier explained without their original theory. But that something else in fact is true. And that theory explains everything that those old theories could not. For example, germ theory explains miasma, whereas miasma cannot explain germ theory. Quantum field theory explains the ether cannot explain quantum field theory.
However, this simply isn't the case.
It is true that it is not the case, but it is trivially true that it is not the case, because it was not the major factor of the said case. It is not the case because no physicist believes the vacuum means nothingness without properties. That is either a complete misunderstanding by James or a lie. The literal meaning of the word vacuum is that without air. It does not mean that without somethingness. Existence University is committed to free minds and the highest quality of content. and as such, we will never take government or corporate financial support. This video was brought to you by Existence University merchandise, available at the Patreon page You Exist, and also by donations through PayPal or Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you.